Is this some kind of joke, old man? The question, laced with the sharp, unearned confidence of youth, cut through the controlled chaos of the training ground. Lieutenant Kevin Finch, his jaw tight and his posture ramrod straight, stared down at the stooped figure before him. The old man, who looked as if a strong breeze might carry him away, had shuffled onto the edge of the observation platform, his faded denim jacket a stark anomaly against the sea of digital camouflage. His eyes, the color of a washed-out winter sky, were fixed on the urban combat simulation unfolding below, where a squad of young Marines practiced breaching a concrete structure. He had said something, a quiet murmur about a load-bearing wall and a flawed entry to Finch, orchestrating the exercise with the obsessive precision of a man terrified of making a mistake, had heard the soft, raspy words as a personal affront, an attack on his authority. He turned from his monitors, his face a mask of indignation, and strode toward the civilian interloper. The old man, Samuel Vance, didn't flinch. He simply stood there, his hands clasped behind his back, his presence as quiet and unassuming as the dust motes dancing in the beams of light slanting through the hangar-like facility. He had been a guest of the base commander, invited to observe the new generation, but Finch neither knew nor cared. All he saw was an elderly civilian who had the audacity to question his meticulously planned training scenario. He repeated his question, louder this time, ensuring the nearby Marines, who had paused their exercise, could hear. Is this some kind of a joke? You think you know more than the United States Marine Corps tactical manuals? Who even let you in here? Samuel's gaze remained on the simulation below, a flicker of something ancient and weary in their depths. He said quietly, his voice a dry rustle of leaves, that wall won't hold. The corner support is a vulnerability, not a strength. They should go in high, not low. Finch let out a short, incredulous laugh. A laugh that was less about humor and more about establishing dominance. Vulnerability? Old man, this structure was designed by the best combat engineers in the Corps. It simulates a standard enemy hardpoint down to the last centimeter of rebar. What would you know about it? Did you build a backyard fort once? The insult hung in the air, thick and unpleasant. Samuel Vance finally turned his gaze from the battlefield below and looked at the young lieutenant. His face, a roadmap of wrinkles and time, was placid, holding no anger, only a deep and profound stillness that seemed to unnerve Finch more than any shouted retort ever could. He offered no defense, no explanation of his credentials. He simply said, "Some things you don't learn from a manual." That quiet dignity was the spark on the tinder of Finch's insecurity. He saw the old man's calm not as a sign of strength, but as the pathetic resignation of a weak, senile fool. He felt the eyes of the Marines on him, a jury of his peers and subordinates, and knew he had to crush this interruption, to reassert his total control. He took a step closer, invading the old man's personal space, his voice dropping to a condescending sneer. "Oh, I see. You're one of those. The back-in-my-day types. Let me guess, you think you can teach these 21st century warriors a thing or two with stories from your time, right, Grandpa? Well, newsflash, the world has moved on. War is about technology, data, precision. It's not about gut feelings from some relic who wandered in off the street." A small crowd was now gathering. The initial squad of Marines, their training exercise forgotten, drifted closer, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. They were young, eager to prove themselves, and the lieutenant was their commander. But there was something in the way the old man stood, an unnerving placidity in the face of such open hostility, that gave them pause. Finch, emboldened by his audience, pressed his attack. He needed a focal point for his ridicule, a symbol of the old man's pathetic nature. And then he saw it. Pinned to the frayed collar of the worn denim jacket was a small, misshapen patch. It was clearly not official military issue. It was faded, the threads worn thin, depicting what looked like a stylized, almost cartoonish ghost or phantom against a black field. It was tiny, barely noticeable, and that made it perfect for his purposes. He reached out a finger and flicked it. "What is this little thing?" Your knitting club's logo? The ghostly grandpa's? He smirked at his own joke, looking to the other Marines for validation. A few of them shuffled their feet, their eyes avoiding his. The object of his mockery, the small, worn patch, felt like a brand of shame, a testament to the old man's foolishness. Finch felt a surge of victory. He had exposed the old man for what he was, an irrelevant, delusional fossil clinging to meaningless trinkets. The old man's hand, gnarled and spotted with age, instinctively went to his collar, his fingers gently touching the fabric just below the patch, a gesture of unconscious protection. "You shouldn't have touched that," he whispered, the words so quiet they were almost lost in the cavernous space. The lieutenant's sneer only widened. "Or what, Grandpa? Are you going to tell me a spooky story?" The air grew thick with a tension that was now deeply uncomfortable. The quiet dignity of the old man was beginning to feel less like weakness and more like the calm at the center of a gathering storm. When Lieutenant Finch's finger made contact with the worn, threaded patch, the world of the sterile training facility dissolved for Samuel Vance. The crisp, conditioned air was replaced by the thick, cloying humidity of a jungle 60 years in the past. The distant, rhythmic hum of the facility's ventilation system warped into the percussive, terrifying thud of incoming mortar fire. The clean scent of floor polish vanished, overwhelmed by the phantom stench of cordite, diesel fumes, and the metallic tang of fresh blood. It was not a memory one recalls, it was a memory one relives. He was no longer a frail old man in a denim jacket. He was 25 years old, his body a tightly coiled spring of muscle and sinew, covered in sweat and grime. He was kneeling in the red clay of a hastily dug command bunker, the world outside a symphony of destruction. His hand, young and steady, was not touching a frayed collar, but gripping the Bakelite handset of a PRC-77 radio. The static crackled with desperation, a young voice, thin and reedy with terror, screaming through the ether. "Ghost 6, this is Nightingale 1. They're through the wire. They're everywhere. We're being overrun. God, we're being overrun." The name, Ghost 6, echoed in the chambers of his soul. It was his name. His identity. His burden. He could feel the grit between his teeth, the sting of sweat in his eyes as he pressed the transmit button. His own voice, firm and unwavering, cut through the panic. "Nightingale 1, you hold the line. Do you copy? You hold that line. Ghost is on the way." It was a promise. A sacred vow made in the heart of chaos, a pledge from a commander to his men. He was Ghost 6, the leader of a unit that did not officially exist, MACVSOG Task Force Phantom. They were the whispers in the dark, the unseen hand that reached into the inferno when all other options had failed. The patch that Finch had just mocked, the small, crude emblem of a ghost, was their soul. It had been designed by a young specialist from Ohio, stitched by hand in a smoky backroom in Saigon, a secret covenant shared by a brotherhood forged in the deadliest of fires. Every thread was a life, every stitch a mission. Looking at the terrified, arrogant face of Lieutenant Finch, Samuel didn't see an officer of the United States Marine Corps. He saw a child playing with fire, utterly oblivious to the ghosts he was provoking. The memory faded as quickly as it had come, leaving an ache in its wake, a profound sorrow for the boy he had been and the terrible price of the wisdom he now possessed. The contrast was a physical blow, the absolute, life-or-death authority he once wielded against the utter powerlessness he felt now, being mocked by a boy who saw his deepest symbol of sacrifice as a joke. He lowered his hand from his collar, and his eyes, now clear and focused, settled on Finch. The ancient weariness was gone, replaced by something else. It was not anger. It was a terrible, pitying clarity. He knew what was about to happen. From a catwalk high above the training floor, Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Thorne watched the entire pathetic drama unfold. He had a career spanning 22 years, long enough to develop an almost preternatural sense for the different flavors of military leadership. He could spot the good, the bad, and the dangerously insecure from 100 paces. Lieutenant Finch was a textbook case of the latter. All crisp uniforms and booming confidence, but with the brittle ego of a man who feared he wasn't worthy of his own rank. Thorne had seen a dozen officers just like him cycle through commands. They were loud, they were dismissive, and they often confused protocol with true respect. And Thorne knew, with the certainty of a seasoned NCO, that you never ever mistake an old man's silence for weakness, especially not on a military installation. There was an unwritten law in the Corps, a piece of tribal knowledge passed down from one generation of NCOs to the next: the quiet ones are the ones you watch out for. They are either janitors or legends, and it was a fool's gamble to assume the former. As Finch escalated his verbal assault, Thorne felt a familiar, hot coil of professional indignation tighten in his gut. Disrespecting an elder, a civilian guest, in front of junior Marines was more than just poor form, it was a poison. It taught the young Marines that rank was a tool for bullying, not a mantle of responsibility. He had started to move, to descend the stairs to intervene, to subtly de-escalate the situation and pull the lieutenant aside for a quiet, educational chat. But then Finch flicked the patch. From his vantage point, Thorne couldn't see the detail, only that it was small, dark, and irregular. Yet, the old man's reaction, that quiet, protective gesture, the almost inaudible whisper, sent a jolt through him. Something clicked in the deep archives of his memory. It wasn't a specific recollection, but the ghost of one. Stories he'd heard as a boot, a lance corporal, sitting in smoke pits listening to the old salts, the Vietnam-era sergeants major who were themselves nearing retirement. They spoke in hushed, reverent tones of things that weren't in the history books. They spoke of shadow wars, of men who went into the dark and never came back, of units whose very existence was a rumor. They spoke of phantoms. The name resonated with the old man's patch. It was a long shot, a wild piece of barracks lore, but Thorne's instincts were screaming at him. He knew intervening directly with Finch was now the wrong move. An officer this insecure, when challenged by an NCO in public, would only double down. The situation would spiral. This was no longer a matter for the local chain of command. This required a bigger hammer. Thorne backed away from the railing, melting into the shadows of the catwalk. He pulled out his encrypted personal data device, a privilege of his rank and security clearance. He scrolled past the numbers for the company commander, the battalion XO, and even the base sergeant major. He went to a contact listed simply as Olympus. It was a direct, back-channel line to the personal aide of the base commandant, General Wallace. It was a number you used when a foreign dignitary had a heart attack on base, or a prototype aircraft had just crashed. It was a career-ending number to call without just cause. He typed a short, coded message: potential whispering giant protocol initiated, Sector Gamma. Subject is elderly male, target of public scorn by LTK Finch. Request immediate Tier 1 verification. Whispering giant was not an official term. It was a code phrase, known only to a select few senior NCOs and officers, for a situation where a legendary, often forgotten or undercover, figure was discovered in a compromising or dangerous position. It was the ultimate handle with care alarm. He hit send, his thumb hovering over the screen for a moment. He had just staked his entire career on a gut feeling and a half-remembered ghost story. He looked back down at the floor, where Lieutenant Finch, high on his own perceived power, was preparing to have the old man physically removed. The response was almost instantaneous. Just as Lieutenant Finch turned to a pair of nearby Marines and barked, "Get this man out of my training area." Now, a sound began to intrude from the outside world. It started as a faint, distant wail, but it grew exponentially, a rising shriek that tore through the air. Every head on the training floor, including Finch's, turned toward the massive bay doors. The wail of sirens became a deafening chorus. Red and blue lights began to strobe against the high windows, painting the cavernous hall in frantic, pulsating flashes of color. Before anyone could process what was happening, the massive, 30-foot-high steel bay doors began to rumble upwards with surprising speed. The sunlight that flooded in was blinding, silhouetting a scene of overwhelming and terrifying authority. A convoy of 3 gleaming black SUVs, the kind reserved for dignitaries and high command, was perfectly positioned just outside, their engines rumbling with latent power. Flanking them were 2 military police tactical vehicles, their light bars still flashing. The scene was one of dramatic, shocking force. A team of MPs, clad in full tactical gear, moved with practiced, intimidating speed, fanning out to form a secure perimeter around the entrance. They didn't shout or give orders. Their presence and formation were a command in itself, freezing everyone in place. The young Marines who had been watching the confrontation now stood rigid, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. This was a level of response they had only ever seen in training videos for assassination attempts or base invasions. Lieutenant Finch stood utterly dumbfounded, his order to remove the old man dying on his lips. His mind raced, trying to comprehend the situation. Was it a drill? A threat? Had he somehow triggered a base-wide security alert? The rear door of the central SUV opened with a quiet, hydraulic hiss. A polished black boot planted itself firmly on the asphalt. Then another. From the vehicle emerged General Harrison Wallace, the 4-star commandant of the entire Marine Corps base. Wallace was a man carved from granite and fury, a living legend in his own right, known for his demanding standards and a stare that could melt steel. He was not a man who made casual appearances. His presence on a lowly training floor was akin to a god descending from Olympus. He was flanked by 2 full-bird colonels, their faces grim and unreadable. The general's eyes, sharp and piercing, swept the room in a single, all-encompassing glance. He took in the scene, the stunned junior Marines, the frozen lieutenant, and the frail old man standing quietly at the center of it all. His gaze lingered for a barest fraction of a second on Finch, and in that instant, Finch felt a cold dread that eclipsed any fear he had ever known. Then, the general's focus shifted, and he began to walk. The general's movements were deliberate, each step echoing with an authority that dwarfed the lieutenant's petty tyranny. He walked not towards the ranking officer in the room, Lieutenant Finch, but directly past him. He didn't even grant Finch a sideways glance, dismissing him as completely as one might dismiss a piece of misplaced furniture. The 2 colonels fell in step behind him, their combined presence creating a moving wall of command that parted the sea of stunned Marines. Finch, who had instinctively puffed out his chest to report, found himself ignored, bypassed, rendered utterly insignificant. The air in the facility grew still and heavy, charged with a silence more profound than any noise. The only sound was the rhythmic clap of the general's polished shoes on the concrete floor as he closed the distance to the old man. Samuel Vance had not moved. He simply stood and watched the approaching storm of brass and power, his expression unchanged. General Wallace came to a halt exactly 3 feet in front of him, the distance prescribed by protocol. For a moment, the 2 men just looked at each other. One a 4-star general at the height of his power, his uniform bristling with ribbons and rank. The other an old man in a faded jacket, his body stooped with age. To the onlookers, it was an impossible tableau. Then, in the dead silence of the hall, General Wallace's body snapped to the most rigid, powerful position of attention Finch had ever witnessed. His back became a steel rod, his chin was tucked, his right hand moved in a blur of motion, slicing through the air to his brow in a salute so sharp, so deeply reverent, it was almost violent. It was not the perfunctory salute given to a superior, it was the salute of a disciple to a master, an acolyte to a SA. The general's voice, a low boom that had commanded entire divisions, filled the cavernous space, imbued with a respect that bordered on awe. He said, "Colonel Vance. It is an honor, sir." The words fell like hammer blows into the silence. Colonel. Sir. The 2 words dismantled reality itself. Lieutenant Finch's jaw went slack. His mind short-circuited. Colonel? This decrepit, Grandpa? He looked at the old man, then at the general holding this profound salute, then back again. It didn't compute. The Marines arrayed around the floor stared in disbelief, their brains struggling to reconcile the image of the mocked old man with the title and the earth-shattering respect being shown by one of the most powerful men in the Marine Corps. The universe had just been turned inside out. Samuel Vance slowly, almost painfully, raised a trembling hand and returned a ghost of a salute, a quiet acknowledgement. He said, "At ease, Harrison. You'll scare the children." It was only then that General Wallace dropped his salute, though his posture remained ramrod straight, his eyes locked on the old man's face. He was no longer a general addressing a civilian, he was a subordinate reporting to his commander. General Wallace held his position of attention, ignoring the request to be at ease. His gaze remained fixed on Colonel Vance, but his words were now directed to the assembly of stunned onlookers, his voice resonating with the clear, cold tone of history being spoken aloud. He gestured with a subtle nod toward the faded patch on Vance's collar, the very same patch Lieutenant Finch had so publicly ridiculed moments before. He said, this lieutenant, in his ignorance, referred to this as a knitting club logo. The general let the words hang in the air, allowing their foolishness to marinate. He then continued, letting the vindication begin. This is the emblem of MACVSOG Task Force Phantom. It is a symbol that doesn't exist in any official record because the men who wore it did not officially exist. They were not soldiers, they were specters. They were the men we sent into the deepest, darkest corners of hell when all hope was lost. They were the ones who held the line when there was no line left to hold. The general's eyes swept over the young Marines, his expression demanding their absolute focus. You read about heroes in your history books. You study battles and campaigns. But you will never read about Task Force Phantom. Their missions were classified at a level beyond top secret, and most of their records were purposefully destroyed to protect the lives they saved and the methods they used. They were ghosts. And this man, this old man, was their leader. He was Ghost 6. The call sign, spoken with such reverence, silenced any remaining whispers of doubt. General Wallace then turned his body slightly, creating a tableau for the benefit of Lieutenant Finch, though he still refused to look at him directly. His voice grew more powerful, a storyteller reciting an epic. 30 years ago, during the siege of Firebase Nightingale, an entire enemy division, over 10,000 strong, descended on a remote outpost defended by fewer than 200 men. For 3 days, they were cut off, surrounded, and subjected to a constant barrage of artillery and human wave attacks. The outpost was considered lost. A formal order to abandon all rescue attempts had been issued. But Captain Vance and his 12-man Phantom team refused to accept that. They were inserted under the cover of a monsoon, deep behind enemy lines, and for 72 straight hours, they conducted a campaign of terror and misdirection. They sabotaged enemy artillery, eliminated their command structure, and created so much chaos that the division commander was convinced he was facing a force 10 times its actual size. Colonel Vance's advice to you today, Lieutenant, about that wall, about the flawed entry point, it wasn't a guess. He invented that tactic. During the siege, he and 3 of his men used that exact structural flaw to infiltrate the enemy's own command bunker, a structure our engineers had deemed impenetrable. They held the line. They saved every single man at Firebase Nightingale. This man's gut feelings are written in the blood and valor of a battle that the world was never allowed to know. The vindication was absolute. It was a complete and total annihilation of Finch's narrative, replacing it with a legend so profound it was almost mythological. The quiet, frail old man was transformed before their eyes into a titan of military history. The small, silly patch was now revealed as a holy relic, a symbol of unimaginable courage. Finally, after an eternity of devastating revelation, General Wallace slowly turned his head. His eyes, burning with an arctic fire, settled on Lieutenant Kevin Finch. The booming voice of the storyteller vanished, replaced by a low, guttural whisper that was infinitely more terrifying. The general took one slow step toward the lieutenant, who now stood pale and trembling, his arrogance stripped away, leaving only the pathetic, naked insecurity beneath. You stand there in a uniform that men like this bled to sanctify. You wear the rank that men like this died to defend. And you used that uniform, that rank, to mock him. To humiliate a living monument to the very honor you swore an oath to uphold. The general was now inches from Finch's face, his voice a venomous hiss. You mistook his humility for weakness. You mistook his silence for senility. You have failed to learn the most fundamental lesson of leadership, that true strength does not need to announce itself. It is quiet. It is patient. It endures. You are not fit to lead Marines. You are not fit to wear this uniform. As of this moment, Lieutenant, you are relieved of your command. The words were a death sentence. Finch's face crumpled, the last vestiges of his composure shattering. General Wallace continued, his voice devoid of all emotion. You will report to my aide. You will be confined to quarters pending a formal board of inquiry. You have disgraced yourself, your rank, and my Marine Corps. Your career as a commissioned officer is over. You will spend the rest of your service, however long we decide that will be, in a position where you can do no more harm. You will learn the lessons of humility and respect far, far from here, in a place where you will have plenty of time for quiet contemplation. He turned his back on the broken officer, the dismissal as total and final as a closing grave. 2 MPs moved forward, their faces impassive, to flank the now sobbing Lieutenant Finch. They placed their hands gently but firmly on his arms, ready to escort him away from the scene of his career's execution. The public rebuke was complete, a brutal and necessary correction delivered with surgical precision. The lesson was not just for Finch, it was for every single Marine present. It was a stark reminder that the emblems of honor were earned in fire, not handed out in ceremonies, and that the greatest legends were often the ones who spoke the least. As the MPs began to guide the utterly devastated Lieutenant Finch away, a quiet voice cut through the thick, charged atmosphere. The voice was raspy and thin, yet it carried an authority that made the 4-star general and his hardened MPs freeze in their tracks. It was Colonel Vance. He had taken a single, shuffling step forward, raising a frail, trembling hand. He said, "General, let the boy be." Every eye in the cavernous hall swiveled back to the old warrior. General Wallace turned, his expression one of confusion. "Sir? This officer's actions were inexcusable. He has failed on every conceivable level of leadership and character. He must be held accountable." Samuel Vance's pale blue eyes, filled not with anger or a sense of vindication, but with a deep and profound sadness, settled on the crumpled figure of Kevin Finch. The young man couldn't even meet his gaze, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. The old colonel's voice remained soft, a stark contrast to the general's iron pronouncements. He said, "He is young, Harrison. We were all young once. The young are loud because they are afraid of not being heard. They are arrogant because they are terrified of being proven weak. You do not break a man to teach him a lesson. You guide him. The Corps needs leaders, not broken men. Send him somewhere he can learn. Somewhere he has to listen. Send him to the place where the quiet ones are. Let him spend a year changing bedpans and listening to stories at the Veterans Hospital. Let him learn that service isn't about giving orders. It's about listening to the pain of others." The magnanimity of the gesture was stunning. The man who had been so cruelly and publicly humiliated was now advocating for his tormentor. He was not offering forgiveness as a pardon, but as a prescription. He was not absolving Finch of his failure, he was outlining the first step on a long, arduous path toward genuine redemption. It was a lesson in grace more powerful than any punishment. General Wallace stared at his old commander, the cold fury in his eyes slowly melting away, replaced by a look of deep understanding and renewed reverence. He saw in that moment the difference between a general and a true leader. A general enforces the rules, a leader mends the men. He held the colonel's gaze for a long moment, a silent conversation passing between them. Then, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. He turned to the MPs, "Release him." Then he looked at the shell-shocked wreck that was once Lieutenant Finch. He said, "You heard the colonel. You have your new orders." The MPs stepped back. Finch, utterly lost, looked up, his face tear-streaked and confused. He looked at the general, then at the old man who had just saved him from total oblivion. For the first time, he saw not a relic, but a man of impossible stature. He could not speak. He could only stand there, broken and remade in the crucible of his own arrogance. The incident at the Advanced Urban Warfare Simulation Center became a quiet legend on the base, a story passed between NCOs in hushed tones. Lieutenant Finch disappeared from the officer corps. In his place, a new mandatory training module was implemented across the entire Marine Corps, a program focused on humility, intergenerational respect, and the unwritten codes of honor. It was officially designated Leadership Module 7, but everyone, from the highest general to the newest private, knew it by its unofficial name, the Vance Protocol. 6 months passed. At the Wounded Warrior and Veterans Care Facility 20 miles from the base, a young man in the simple uniform of a private first class was meticulously mopping a long, sterile hallway. His movements were no longer sharp and arrogant, but quiet, methodical, and respectful. Former Lieutenant, now Private Kevin Finch, worked with a focus he had never known before. His days were spent not issuing commands, but cleaning floors, assisting nurses, and, most importantly, listening. He had sat for hours at the bedsides of forgotten heroes, men who had stormed the beaches of Iwo Jima, who had frozen at the Chosin Reservoir, who had bled in the jungles of Vietnam. He had heard their stories, their triumphs, their sorrows, and in their quiet dignity, he finally began to understand the lesson Colonel Vance had tried to teach him. One afternoon, as he was emptying a trash can in the quietest wing of the hospital, he saw a familiar figure. Samuel Vance was sitting in a wheelchair by a large window overlooking a garden, a simple blanket over his knees. He was just staring out at the trees, as still and silent as the day Finch had met him. Finch froze, his heart pounding. He hadn't seen the colonel since that day. He wanted to apologize, to explain, to somehow express the profound change that had occurred within him, but the words wouldn't form. They felt cheap, inadequate. Instead, he simply returned to his duty. He took the new, clean liner for the trash can and carefully fitted it inside. He wiped a small smudge from the lid. He did his job, quietly and humbly. As he turned to leave the room, a raspy voice drifted from the window. The colonel hadn't turned, hadn't even moved his head. He just said, "A clean floor is a good start, son." Finch stopped, his back still to the old man. The words were not a pardon. They were not praise. They were an acknowledgement. A single, small brick laid on the foundation of a long road to redemption. A flicker of understanding, a quiet moment of grace that completed the circle. Finch didn't reply. He simply nodded to himself, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek, and walked away, ready to clean the next floor. If you were moved by the story of Colonel Vance and the enduring power of respect, please show your support by liking this video, sharing it with others who honor our veterans, and subscribing to Veteran Valor for more stories of quiet heroism. Remember that heroes walk among us every day, often in the quietest, most unassuming forms.